My name is Schoen, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Breaktime. We're a Boston-based organization working to break the cycle of young adult homelessness. And I'm joined here today by two of my wonderful colleagues and an alumni of our program, Mikayla Woodberry and Jasmine Hicks. So I'd love to pass it over to Mikayla to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mikayla Woodberry. I am the Program Ambassador Recruitment for Breaktime.
My name is Jasmine, and I am the Program Ambassador of Training and Research in Breaktime.
At Breaktime, we really believe that no young person should have to experience housing insecurity. And the way that we're addressing housing insecurity for young people is specifically through employment and financial empowerment. So our program starts with 3 weeks of professional development training, which Jasmine leads. Then all of our associates, the young people we work with, transition to a 3-month job placement at a local nonprofit or small business where they're working day-to-day building skills for their own long-term career prospects, while also having an impact right here in the community at the local nonprofits and small businesses we partner with. After those job placements, we continue to support young people for the long term, providing continued financial support, credit counseling, pathway coaching as they're navigating different educational and career opportunities, and just a continued community of support around helping each associate to attain not only job and financial security, but ultimately housing security for the long term. At Breaktime, we believe that every single young person deserves the opportunities and support that they need to reach their full potential. And we're working in collaboration with many other organizations, with the government, with small businesses, and many others to make that a reality. Today, we'd love to talk through some of the big topic issues that we grapple with here at Breaktime. And we hope that this conversation will shed a light on the challenges that young people experiencing homelessness face, in some of the ways that we collectively as young people can advocate and make a difference for the lives of our peers experiencing homelessness. So I'd love to start it off by talking a little bit about youth shelters in particular. So one of my first jobs was working at a youth shelter. I worked at the Y2Y Youth Shelter, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a shelter specifically for 18 to 24-year-olds experiencing homelessness, which is really interesting because a lot of shelters, the vast majority of shelters across the United States, are general shelters for any adult experiencing homelessness, 18 plus. And that comes with its own set of challenges. So I'd love to pass it over to you, Mikayla, to talk about any observations you have about the challenges young people in particular face in these adult shelter systems, and sort of what the impetus to start youth-specific shelters really is.
Yeah, so in 2020, I became homeless and I was staying at Bridge Over Troubled Waters. But during my time period of being homeless, I also obtained a job at Boston Public Health Commission working at the shelters for them, and as a case manager and also a cook. Being able to see the difference between while I was working at the Health Commission, but also from just my life experience, I definitely saw the differences as far as services and things that I can obtain from each shelter. So like if I had ended up choosing to go to an adult shelter instead of a youth shelter, my services would have probably been different. Some of the things I saw while working at the Health Commission is many of the adults are able to get IDs, birth certificates, and social security cards free of charge with the help of their case manager, that many youth shelters don't have that ability. And usually a youth has to pay for those type of services to get their ID or social security card or birth certificate. So I definitely saw a difference in that. Many youth shelters are usually lottery based, so they only accept a certain amount of youth into a particular youth shelter, compared to many of the emergency shelters in Boston pertaining to adults 18 and plus, where you can 24/7, so you can walk in whenever you want and you're guaranteed a bed or somewhere to stay. So that's also another difference I saw, that it's unfair, and felt like kind of realizing why is that a difference? Why aren't youth getting more of those services? And understandable, there are many 18 plus who are veterans, have disabilities, and other things, but there are also youth that I feel like don't get that necessarily service that they may get if they are an adult, that if they do have those type of services and support, it definitely would be helpful for them.
Based on your experience, the youth specific shelter resources are vital, but they don't exist enough to where there are many young people who just can't even get into these shelters in the first place. And that really aligns with my experience working in the youth shelter. We had basically every night about half the people who requested to stay in the shelter we could actually take into the shelter. And we had something like 25, 30 beds. So it was such a limited number for the need that exists. And it's interesting to hear how, based on your experience working at the Boston Public Health Commission, the adult shelter systems don't necessarily always run into those same challenges. So we're sort of creating these youth-specific resources, but then not resourcing them enough to actually be fully helpful to the young people who need them the most. Jasmine, I'd love to loop you into the conversation here and just see if you have any perspective on youth shelter resources and what challenges exist that we should be addressing around these resources.
I know for me, when it comes to challenges with the youth shelter, the shelter I was in, I was thankfully was really good. Not the complete best, but compared to majority, they did pretty good with making sure we had food and trying to be as resourceful as they could. But I do know the average youth shelter in general is not like that. It's definitely a huge difference, and I got very, very lucky that I got to be in that kind of position in terms of just having people who were pretty resourceful and helpful. And if they weren't able to be resourceful, they were able to find someone else who was. So my experience with homelessness is a little bit different in a shelter that I was in. I know Mikayla definitely touched up on that a lot, but I would like to definitely discuss some barriers that I noticed to employment, because I do notice that a lot of youth at the shelter were having multiple issues, and it's not just them. I grew up with a lot of friends who also had the same kind of issue. And even just, in learning even about the research, about barriers to employment with youth in terms of, about, I would say, like around ages 16 or 17 to 24. A lot of youth have the tendency to have a lot of psychological issues that can cause them to have barriers to employment. There's a lot of things we don't always talk about, but I know we're starting to get into the kind of world where we're encouraging psychologists, we're encouraging therapists, because it's actually quite common. And I do feel like, from what I've seen in the shelter and what I've seen with friends of mine, a lot of them are having issues with stress, depression, and anxiety, um, eating disorders, sleeping disorders, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts. These things are very, very, they're very essential, and they're definitely a big hindrance. If your mental health is not there, it can be very hard to keep a stable job going. So just in seeing that with a lot of friends of mine and a lot of youth that was in the shelter, they were having issues keeping stable jobs because they weren't able to get the help that they needed. Lack of insurance, lack of supportive resources. They weren't able to get that kind of support that they needed in order to become more stable. And then on top of that, I noticed there's a pressure to kind of meet the societal, social, professional, and personal standards all at the same time. And that can also put a lot of pressure on you, that they have to be a certain place at a certain time in their life. And everyone's journey is very different. I think not having any guidance can definitely be a problem. I think mentors play a vital role as well in helping them stay on the right track. And I also noticed that they have to fight against a lot of stigmas. A lot of people have stigmas that houseless youth are all lazy, that they don't want to work, that they all use substances. And although there are many that, yes, that may be true, but it's not true for everyone, and they shouldn't have to fight against those stigmas all the time. Sometimes people kind of close the door in their face before even giving them a chance to get to know them. So fighting against those stigmas is also another barrier. I've noticed that lack of education, lack of skills is another issue. A lot of youth that are trying to get themselves together are they're not qualified for the jobs that they are applying to. And a lot of these jobs want experience, and it's like if it's your first job, you have to start somewhere. And so I've noticed that they're looking for trainings, and a lot of people are not really willing to train like they used to be back then. And that's also another barrier to employment. So there's not a lot of places for them to gain the skills that they need in order to be successful. Not having references or not having contacts, if it's your first job, you don't really have contacts, you don't really have references, that can be really rough too, because a lot of jobs want to see references and contacts, and they're not really thinking about the fact that it's their first job all the time. Unless you get someone who's nice enough to give you that chance, majority are like you need to have someone, and they're making it kind of like mandatory for a lot of jobs. And of course, we've definitely seen a lack of IDs and residential proof, which I find to be an issue as well with a lot of youth. Is it's kind of awkward when you're homeless. What do you put on the application? That can kind of be a problem when they have a lack of address. It makes things complicated to get the work documents in to be able to continue forward with their hiring process, which I've noticed. And I will pass it back to Connor.
I think you really highlighted a lot of different barriers that young people face who are experiencing homelessness while trying to get a job. And that brings us to our next topic here, which is what are those barriers to employment that young people face and how we can support young people in overcoming them. So one of the stigmas that I hear a lot that young people face is they hear from people, why can't you just get a job? And Jasmine, I think you did a really wonderful job of explaining the multitude of reasons why that's a challenge, whether it's lack of connections and references or lack of stability to support somebody in being able to maintain a job, lack of a stable home address to even put on a job application to begin with. We see again and again the many different ways that folks experiencing homelessness can face barriers when trying to get a job and when trying to maintain that job. That's why we actually started Breaktime in the first place 4 years ago. While I was working at the Y2Y shelter, I saw again and again how so many young people could face discrimination throughout the job application process because they had to put the shelter address down instead of another address, and they were screened out of application processes. For folks who did get a job, I saw the challenges they faced in maintaining that job because of everything else that was going on in their lives. So Breaktime exists really to provide job security to young people experiencing homelessness. We hire young people onto our payroll, and we hire them to work at local nonprofits and small businesses. So they know that they are getting a paycheck from us every week, and they have the support of us in working with their employers to ensure that if any challenges come up, we're an extra reference point and an extra mediator in working through those challenges. But Mikayla and Jasmine are both doing really critical work in making all of this possible. Mikayla's leading our recruitment efforts, and Jasmine's leading the training that prefaces all of these job placement experiences. So I'd love to dive deeper into the work that you both are doing and how it is alleviating barriers to employment for young people. Mikayla, for you in particular, you're the one who gets folks in the door at Breaktime. You're the one who gets young people to our programs to begin with. I'd love to hear from you, your observations from the interview process of working with young people and hearing about barriers they're facing, what you're learning from your day-to-day recruitment work that could be helpful insights to share.
So Breaktime is very important for the youth as far as that job training aspect. Given my experience of being a case manager Many of the shelters have job training programs within the shelters, such as the Health Commission that has a job training program where you can be a part of cooking the meals every day for the shelter or cleaning the shelters, but you're also living there. So it's access to them where they're staying and then also job placement that I feel like should also be implemented in youth shelters just as an easy way to, one, get that reference. They're able to get a reference from somebody who's working in the shelter because that's their supervisor or somebody they're working around. But it's also, they know their struggles because they're also living there. It's also a way for them to get employment and get income that, again, it's easy access because that's also where they're staying. So they don't have to travel anywhere or feel like they can't get there every day because it's right in front of them. And I think a lot of youth don't get that opportunity, but programs like Breaktime is great because it's still getting us that job training aspect that we may not even be able to receive at such a young age, and being able to create those references, get that job employment experience, being able to get an income. So being able to work and do the recruitment is great because I feel like I'm helping. I'm able to help another youth go through the same process I went through and hopefully have a great outcome as well. Being able to kind of be that starting point of trying just to get to know the youth, getting to know kind of their story and what they went through, and then being able to hopefully get them connected with Break Time is great. It's definitely struggling somewhat, especially during the pandemic, because we don't really know where youth are right now. They may not have that many resources, so they may have to look elsewhere instead of going to shelters. Especially, like I said, many of them are lottery based and only can take a certain amount of people. So having that job training aspect, like Break Time and other organizations who are also doing that, it's great just as a way to help the youth get started.
Jasmine, I'd love to hear from you as well about the work that you're doing to alleviate some of the barriers to employment that you talked about, and just how the Launchpad training is working to address those challenges.
So my position being the program ambassador of training and research, my job is made out of, two parts. One with co-facilitating Launchpad, and the other with serving as a representative for young adults experiencing housing insecurity in meetings with potential partner organizations and more. And Launchpad is the first stage of Breaktime's program, and it's a 2-week readiness job training where the focus is on growing every young adult's professional development, personal development, and financial empowerment. And in my experience, I feel like in doing this job, it's super important because I used to say to my boss all the time, I was like, I feel like we are like a parent. Launchpad is like the first parent in these kids' lives. And I say that because we provide a structure and we're teaching them things that even I've noticed in a lot of adults don't have this knowledge, but they would like to. I've showed the curriculum and even done the curriculum with, friends, family members, and they're like, wow, like the content's really good. Like everyone should know that. Why don't they teach everyone this? And we're not really taught in school to talk about how to financially budget. We're not really taught in school about how to build your credit so that you can get apartments, so that you can get houses, so that you can get cars, auto loans, anything that you need support from the bank when it comes to managing and budgeting and just general knowledge of money management. We're not taught these things in school. We're not taught these things in college either. We're not ever really taught about it at all. And I think we kind of skip that. And it's like, I don't understand why, but that also creates a huge, huge barrier. And it's kind of like everyone just has to figure it out on their own. I feel like with break time, we understand that no, that's not the way it should be. It should be taught like everything else. And, we teach things like history, we teach things like Pythagorean theorem, but we didn't think to talk about money management. We didn't think to teach the kids how to live life, how to keep a stable job, which would in tune help them to keep stable housing. We didn't think about those things, but we thought about the things they most likely wouldn't use in school, and these are so important. What good is all this knowledge if we don't even know how to sustain ourselves and how to survive and take care of ourselves in this life? And these are so many steps that a lot of adults still in their 40s and 50s that I meet all the time still don't know, because they were never taught, and only very few have found those answers, but a lot of them found it from what I have spoke to them later in life. And if you know, you should try to teach others. But I think that's why Breaktime plays such a vital role, and why Launchpad plays a vital role, because we understand that there's a need out there, there's a gap that we kind of fill. And not kind of, we fill it, because we are teaching them in Launchpad money management, we're teaching them how to build credit, we're teaching them skills that they need in a job place, we're teaching them how to identify their weaknesses, how to identify their strengths, and how to work on themselves. We are teaching them not just about their financial development, but their personal too, challenges that they may personally face. For instance, I've seen young adults come in and they have personal challenges like dyslexia, and we try to provide as much support as we can to help them and see what else we can do. There are multiple different challenges. I don't know, maybe they have anger issues. We try to provide, well, okay, let's see what are the resources we have. Let's see what kind of context we have when it comes to therapists. Let's see what we can do to help this young adult be more successful. And we also talk about the things that it takes to sustain a job, get a job, keep a job, what that looks like. We talk about, for instance, conflict is one of the subjects that we talk about, dependability, self-care, which is another thing. Self-care goes a long way, not just with your physical health, but your mental health. That is a really big thing. There's a lot that Launchpad does, and it's a gap that again needs to be filled in the world. It's not just with young adults, but with older adults as well. And a lot of the things that I see us teaching in Launchpad is a lot. I feel like if everyone was taught this, it would, I think it would help a lot of people in general, because I see a lot of the adults that are homeless. I feel like if they at least had a one up with the education, we're not educating enough people on this. And that lack of knowledge, I think, plays a big role in homelessness as well. And I love that we provide the education for people to know and understand the things that we discuss and talk about. We discuss, how to deal with conflict. We discuss, with the Attorney General's office, and allow them to ask questions about things like, what are your labor laws, which a lot of youth gets tricked on, and again, that lack of education, they're not really taught, how to maintain, how to keep. They're not taught about so many of these things, and Launchpad fills that gap. And so they get to learn, oh, this is what dependable means. Oh, so this is what reliable means. Oh, so they start to learn a lot of key components that doesn't just teach them to get a job, but teaches them it's a life skill. You're always going to need everything that you learn in Launchpad. You will always need and utilize for the rest of your life. But it is something, like I said again, that it's not taught. It's a big gap, and they kind of just leave the youth to kind of figure it out on their own. And us filling that gap, once again, is vital. It's crucial. It's a necessity, Like I know when I have kids, I'm sending them to Breaktime. I'm sending them to Breaktime to learn about Launchpad, to teach them all the classes. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Jasmine. And it's always so inspiring to hear from you, because you're leading the development and delivery of all of this programming. the professional development, personal empowerment, and financial literacy that young people are getting from Breaktime are really coming from the work that you're doing with others on our team to bring that programming to young people. So I always love hearing your perspective on this. And one thing that I would also like to explore is how housing plays into the equation here. Because for young people experiencing homelessness, there's such a unique set of barriers to employment that we've discussed. And providing the foundational training, those soft skills like conflict resolution, as you mentioned, Jasmine, is a piece of the puzzle. Providing supported employment opportunities where young people have job security, they have an organization that's backing them, that's working with their employer. That's another piece of the puzzle. But where does housing fit into all this? And that's something I get asked a lot. And I think, something that is being talked about more and more is this idea of a housing first approach, and beginning with housing and wrapping around other supports so that people have the basic stability of housing to go off of as they're building stability in other parts of their life. So, Mikayla, I'd love to hear from you about how you interacted with this concept at your time with the Boston Public Health Commission. This was something that came up. And then also just from your own experience, why this philosophy of housing first is important and why you think that people should know about it.
In my opinion, housing first approach has its pros and cons. I personally don't think it's a good method, just in a sense that with housing somebody without dealing with their kind of barriers that they're facing sometimes can be a downfall with housing. When I worked at the Boston Public Health Commission, a main barrier and problem was the opioid crisis that is still going on. So having to house individuals that may have problems that need to be addressed just for their safety reasons, even for housing them, was my main concern. So even though that's great that we're getting them into housing and that we're getting them their own place, we also have to face the fact that we never know what's really going to happen to them. As a case manager, once I house somebody, that's it. I'm done. My job's done. But I always in the back of my mind was worried about what's going on with that individual. But because I'm housing them first, I couldn't worry about their problems anymore after I housed them because my job's done. I housed them. That's what my main job was. Even though it was great to see the smile on their face when they got into their own place, it also was a concern to know that how long would they be there? Opioid addiction affect them keeping a place. Will they save money for rent or will they spend it on something else that they shouldn't be? Will they be safe as far as making sure no strangers or certain people are in their apartments? There were different things that I thought about when housing somebody. For me, I had the same approach at my shelter. I was housed first before I really kind of touched on the other aspects that I needed, such as employment. And it was great. Like I said, I was able to be in my own place, getting the sense of rent and how to do that and saving, but also at the same time, probably needed a little more work on that. May not have had the best saving kind of methods, but knowing that I was in my own place, kind of had to maneuver as far as what I was doing, what I was spending my money on, but I wasn't there yet. Kind of wish that I took a step back, probably stayed at the shelter a little longer before I made that move, just to make sure I didn't backtrack. So even though I feel like the housing first approach helps definitely get people into their own apartment and own house and own place or rooming home or whatever, being able to address their needs first is important. Many deal with mental illness, like I said, maybe have drug addiction or certain problems. And I feel like if you house somebody that has those type of problems, you kind of never know the outcome. And you hope that it's a good outcome. You hope that they stay strong through it and that they end up being okay. But then there's also those individuals that don't make it. And there's been many that don't make it.
Mhm. It's a really helpful perspective, Mikayla. And I think I've seen Housing First defined in a lot of different ways. But according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, um, when they're talking about the Housing First model, they state that supportive services are offered to people once they get into housing, but participation is not required,
Right.
as these services have been found to be more effective when a person chooses to engage. So it sort of centers client choice in its methodology. I'd love to hear from you, Mikayla, whether you think there should be a requirement exchange for housing, because what I'm hearing is that when we adopt a housing first mentality, but then don't deal with the other challenges, that those challenges, just don't go away and can even get worse in some instances. So do you think that there should be certain supportive services that are required in connection with the housing? Or how do you think, if you could wave a magic wand and change the system, what would you do to restructure the way that we go about housing people first, in social services?
I think being able to give them the resources they need before we house them is important. From my own experience, I went through 4 case managers. When I got housed, my case manager changed. Then down the time, my case manager changed again. And I wasn't informed my case manager changed because nobody was checking up on me. So it wasn't until I tried to go to my shelter to say, hey, I need help with this and that. Well, this new case manager doesn't know who I am because they were never met. Case manager is supposed to do check-ins at wherever you're staying, but that doesn't happen. Even as when I was a case manager, I had to pass my caseload over to somebody else once I housed that individual. And then 9 times out of 10, they wasn't checking up on that person, or they had to contact me because they didn't know certain things about that individual who I housed. So changing a case manager also has its struggles because you're meeting somebody new. They don't know you. You have to tell your story all over again. You have to tell them your needs all over again. And it makes it hard because sometimes your needs and your wants are forgotten. Sometimes you're, as just an individual overall, you're forgotten about. So hoping that if people get those resources they need before they're housed, whether it's letting them know where hospitals are, letting them know where you can go for therapy, or if you need food and kind of things like necessities, where to go and get that, not waiting until I do get housed and then somewhat I got to figure it out on my own. But there's a case manager somewhere, but I don't know where they are.
So it's sort of that discontinuity in services that's created when your housing status changes, that can disrupt all the work that you're doing on stuff outside of the housing. While getting people into housing is, of course, a number one priority, we can't forget to continue to support them with everything else and just say that our job is done once that housing is achieved, which I think is central to our philosophy of Breaktime, of focusing on employment and focusing on financial security, because there are pieces of the puzzle, again, that aren't solved by housing. So housing is essential. Housing is at the root of the problem, but it isn't the only problem. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because I think as we've taught, as we as a society have engaged with the concept of housing first, I think people interpret it in a lot of different ways. The root of the housing first model comes from a really sophisticated social service model that comes with all of these other supportive services. So you get permanent supportive housing, you get supportive employment, you get supportive case management that stays with you. And over time, we've just certain folks have simplified it to just be about the housing. But I think what we need to recognize, and what you're pointing out, Mikayla, is that all those other pieces that come with the housing, or they're supposed to come with the housing, are essential to making the whole thing work.
there's simple things like a Section 8 voucher that I noticed is 9 times out of 10 easier for somebody who's 65 plus, has a disability, um, compared to somebody who's 18 to 24 years old, to get access to something like that. When I entered the shelter, I was told to enter the lottery to obtain a Section 8 voucher. And then within 90 days, I would hopefully receive one. It's been 2.5 years now and I haven't, but I know from working at a shelter with adults who are that 65 years and older, who have that disability, who may obtain Social Security income, that they're more likely to get it faster than somebody who's younger, just because of those necessities that are needed for application process. So I think if something like that was much more easier for somebody who's younger to obtain, it would help. A lot of housing complexes and apartments going up, but 9 times out of 10, we're not going to qualify for it. Whether it's income limits, things like being 65 years older. There are income restricted units in most apartments in Boston, as that's kind of what they have to have, but still, young adults who are just entering kind of the employment world and saving may not have $2,000, $3,000 saved up to pay for rent every month, or have a first, last, and security saved to pay for their apartment when they get one. So it's definitely a struggle, and I feel like something that could be addressed.
Jasmine, I'd love to loop you into the conversation, see if you have any thoughts on the challenges that exist within the current housing system, particularly for youth who don't have access to the same resources as some other populations.
I do remember having, like I said, a lot of friends who had a lot of trouble and had a lot of different issues going on. And I can relate to the whole case manager thing, because even currently right now, I don't know who my case manager is. No one, I haven't heard a word. I have no clue where to even go or even how to, I don't know what resources I have. All I know is I'm sitting and waiting for housing somewhere, but there's no one has communicated or reached out. Like she said, everything she said is completely on point. And I am still currently, I was actually getting ready to reach out to someone to ask, do you know how I can get a case manager? Is there something I can be doing to be working on trying to get housing? How do I go about that? I don't even know who to ask, who to go to, but thankfully I have Breaktime. You guys are super resourceful. So like, I was just getting ready to reach out, and all I can think of was how complicated things can get, and how, like she said, they kind of just drop you. And like, I got so tired when I did have a case manager of repeating myself over and over and over again. It's like, didn't we talk about this already? We've had this conversation multiple times, and they're like, I know, I'm sorry. I just need you to repeat it again. I know you've already spoken to several other people. And I'm like, well, why does the case manager even have to change in the first place? It makes everything so much more complicated. And you get to a point where you're just kind of like, you might give up for a little bit, but then you still need housing. So even though you're frustrated, you're still seeking for those resources. But a lot of us are kind of just forgotten about, like she said. And it's a very frustrating process. You can get housing, but if you don't know how to sustain it, like I see a lot of people, they get housing and then they lose it because of different issues they have going on. Some of them it's just, due to, not having lack of education and not knowing how to maintain a home. There should be a guide there. They always say it's good to seek counsel, but if there's no counsel, then you're on your own. Definitely noticed a lot of that going on, and I can just relate to almost everything that Mikayla has touched on, and I think she said everything to the T. She kind of said everything that I have seen other people go through, and I myself have been through as well. And the cycle kind of continues. And me personally, I feel like people shouldn't I think housing is good in terms of you're stress free when you know you have a home to go over and you have food to eat. But on the other hand, if you don't know how to maintain that housing, you don't know how to pay rent, you don't know, you don't have a sense of time, you're not on time with your payments. I really think it's important to talk about the barriers to employment first, because I see so many people and I'm just like, man, like, you guys got housing, you're so lucky, you should be happy, you should be doing all you can to maintain that. And like, they are so wiped up in addiction, or sometimes so stressed out with everything going on, they start to let everything slip through the cracks because they're not getting the psychological help that they need, they're not getting a therapist, or they lack insurance, so they can't get this, they can't get that. There's pros and cons to housing first. But for me, I personally feel like we should deal with the barriers first. But I feel like if you're getting housing, you know, it should be a requirement if you know that this person has an addiction or they need some mental health help. It should be a requirement for them to get that help that they need. It should be a requirement for them to get help with this addiction first. So I definitely really agree with everything Mikayla said, and definitely agree it should be mandatory, and that we should stick to barriers first.
Well, thank you, Jasmine. I'm always learning so much from both you and Mikayla. And I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is that, we put a lot of emphasis on building more housing stock or building more affordable housing units, which is absolutely essential. But we can't do that and ignore the support services at the same time. We have to think about building housing as building housing and building support services together. And I think this question of whether those support services should be mandatory or not is really interesting. Something that I think we should definitely dive into more in a future conversation with more youth and really get perspectives on it. But what I'm hearing is that the failure in the system is really that the support services that y'all were promised, or the support services that you were looking for, were failing you. And I think that's why at Breaktime, we try to broadly define young adults experiencing homelessness, because just because you are in a shelter one day and then housed the next day doesn't mean that all these challenges you were facing go away. Other barriers that housing insecurity has created are staying with you. So we can't just, as Jasmine, you were saying, we can't just ignore all those other barriers and just say housing will fix it all. For folks who are listening, I just want to call out some of the ways that people can get involved in this conversation. One of the key pieces of federal legislation that's out there right now is the Connecting Youth to Jobs Act. The Connecting Youth to Jobs Act is something that will provide funding to create supportive transitional job opportunities at a living wage for young people all across the United States. As Mikayla and Jasmine were mentioning, just because a young person can potentially access housing, which already has all of its own barriers, as Mikayla was talking about with the Section 8 process, even if you're able to get into that housing, barriers to employment still exist, and a myriad of other challenges are still there. The Connecting Youth to Jobs Act will help us to create more supportive job opportunities for young people so that we can address barriers to employment as we address barriers to housing and other challenges as well. The Connecting Youth to Jobs Act would be huge for organizations like Breaktime, who are looking to scale our work and to make sure that more young people have access to the types of job opportunities they need to get into the workforce and to build up job and financial security in addition to housing security. So I encourage you to look into that bill, to call your legislator, send an email to your legislator, both your local representative and your senators, to ensure that they're aware of this legislation, the way it impacts young people. And we have more information about other advocacy issues and things we're working on at breaktime.org. Encourage you to check us out and find out other ways to get involved. Mikayla, Jasmine, and I are continuing to learn from one another and from other young people every single day. And so we'd love for you to continue to be a part of this learning community and continue to work with us to advocate to break the cycle of young adult homelessness, because it's really going to take all of us young people to make this happen. So I thank you for tuning into the conversation today. Super excited to hopefully get to work with you all more. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.